In this last video, we're going to talk about our last link in the chain of infection. We're going to talk about the mode of transmission. The mode of transmission is the means by which a pathogen moves from one individual to another. The mode of transmission is the means by which a pathogen moves from one individual to another. A couple vocabulary words that relate to the mode of transmission. A disease can be a communicable disease, and you've probably heard that term used before, and that means that that disease can be passed from one individual to another. It's a communicable disease. It's going to be an infectious disease, and it's going to be one that can be passed from one person to another. And so you can probably think of lots of communicable diseases, colds and flus and whatnot. Herpes, with my cold sore there, that's a communicable disease. It can be passed from one person to another. A contagious disease is a communicable disease that's easily passed from person to person. A contagious disease is one that's easily passed from person to person. So contagious disease is not just a yes or no, it's kind of a relative thing. So I would say if somebody has the flu, the influenza virus is communicable. You can pass it from person to person. And in fact, you can stand in a room and be 5 feet or 10 feet away from somebody, and you can pass the flu virus to them. They can acquire the flu even if they don't touch you. So I would say that that's a contagious disease. Cold viruses are also communicable. They can pass them from person to person, but they're not quite as contagious as influenza viruses, because it turns out that cold viruses don't travel through the air quite as easily as influenza viruses do. Usually a cold virus needs a droplet of water around it. So we would say cold viruses are contagious, but not quite as contagious as influenza virus. Something like my cold sore. You're not going to get a cold sore by walking in the same room that I have. So I would say a cold sore is relatively low on the scale of being contagious, but it also is a communicable disease, one that you can transfer from person to person. There are non-communicable infectious diseases, and they're less common than communicable ones, but non-communicable diseases would be things like tetanus, that you actually pick up the pathogen from the soil. So you get a tetanus is the tetanus bacteria are living in the soil and living and growing there, and you get a cut and there's some dirt in it, or piece of glass, or I don't know, piece of metal or something like that, cut you from the soil, but some of that dirt gets in you with the bacteria. You can get tetanus that way, but you're not going to spread it to someone else. They're going to also have to be exposed to that soil. So it is an infectious disease, but it's not a communicable disease. Okay, so here we are with table 11.7 from your textbook, and there's a lot of information in here, so I recommend looking at this. And it says, explain the concept of mode of transmission. So like we said, mode of transmission is the mechanism by which a pathogen moves from one host to another. So these would be communicable diseases. And let's see, it says vertical, direct, indirect, and vector. What I'd like to do, actually, I think I changed this a little bit. Oh, no, I didn't. Okay. Yeah, and so what I'd like to look at here is the mode of transmission. I'm going to say the primary vertical. Instead of saying vertical, I would say placenta. Remember, vertical transmission is from one generation to a next. So this is something that you would get from your parents or you'd pass to your children. And the most common way that we do that before the child is born is through the mother, through the placenta. And that's what it says right there. And the other ones they're so minor that I'm not going to really deal with those. The placenta, though, is kind of a big deal because a fetus developing inside their mother is mostly free of microorganisms. And so if a pathogen can pass from the mother through the placenta to the developing fetus, that's a big deal because that fetus doesn't have a lot of protection. One thing I would like to mention about diseases that use the mode of transmission via the placenta is there's actually a description, and this is not in your book, but I think it's important to be aware of. These diseases are in a group that we call the torch diseases or the torches infections. And this is a group of diseases, an acronym that was developed to try to help people remember what pathogens are typically able to be transferred through the placenta from the mother to the developing fetus. And here they are, Toxoplasma gondii. We mentioned this one when we talked about protozoans because we said that the pregnant moms aren't supposed to be changing cat litter in case the cat is shedding toxoplasma. And one of the big problems with that is it can go from the mother's blood into the fetus through the placenta. There's a whole group of others, Listeria and varicella zoster virus in here. The R is rubella, German measles, cytomegalovirus, herpes simplex virus, and HIV, and S is syphilis. So these torches diseases are the ones that we know can be transferred via the placenta from the mom to the baby. And this is not it's not common, but if a baby does become infected or a developing fetus does become infected with one of those pathogens, it can have serious consequences. So the mode of transmission for some diseases is via the placenta. The other ones I have are direct, indirect, and vector. Pathogens that are spread by direct contact, that sounds pretty easy. Close proximity, actual physical contact. You kiss somebody and you spread a disease, you can spread a pathogen to them directly. If you touch a person, you might be able to spread a pathogen to them directly. Sexual contact would be direct contact. There's one that's not quite as intuitive, and it's droplet contact. When I was talking about cold viruses needing a little bit of water around them to be transferred from person to person, these would be considered droplets. And if you look at this picture in your book, you've probably seen pictures like this before, where it kind of has it really well lit of somebody sneezing. And you can see these droplets. And if you can see this picture really well, you'll notice that some of them are falling down because they actually have weight. And so the droplets can end up on a lot of surfaces. Some pathogens are spread that way. And so a lot of times if you get a cold, it might be because you touched a tabletop where somebody else, wiped their nose or sneezed, and you've gotten those droplets, and then you rub your nose, and it gets in your body. Droplet transmission is considered direct contact. And the reason why is just because it has to be relatively it's a relatively quick kind of transmission because droplets dry up. Consider droplet transmission about the length of your arm. So if somebody has a cold and you try to stay about arm's length away from them, you're much less likely to get that cold than if you're close, or if you're touching surfaces and rubbing your eyes and things like that. So droplets are considered direct contact, and some pathogens are transferred that way. Cold viruses, like I said, always need the droplet around them. The other ones, so we have placenta, we have direct contact, we have indirect contact, and the indirect contact, there's some vocabulary within there. That a fomite is an inanimate object that can transmit pathogens. So doorknobs, phones, faucet handles. A patient might have an infectious disease in a hospital, and there's fomite precautions in the room, meaning you've got to be aware that any inanimate object in the room might be contaminated with that pathogen. So if you have COVID or if you have the flu, you can transfer the pathogen to objects, to a pen, and that pen, now someone else uses the pen is the fomite. And so it's an inanimate object that transfers the pathogen. Another vocabulary word we have there is vehicle. Vehicle is another mechanism of indirect contact, And a vehicle is something that moves the pathogen from one place to another. So that would be things like air. Air can be a vehicle for indirect transmission of a pathogen. Air, if a pathogen is being carried along in the air, we say that it's been aerosolized. And so if we look at these pictures again of the highlighted sneeze, a lot of the droplets are going to fall down. So that would be droplet transmission we would call that direct contact. But some of these particles are going to be small enough that they actually can float away in the air. And some pathogens can tolerate being in the air for periods of time. And therefore, we would call that indirect contact. And those pathogens that can move with the air are more likely to get somebody infected because they can travel farther than arm's length. So cold viruses probably won't move about more than about arm's length from your body, but flu viruses can become airborne in aerosols, and they can survive for long enough to transfer from one person to another. So if somebody has the flu, you just really need to stay away from them. It's a lot easier to contract the flu from them because that virus can be spread in aerosols. Other vehicles are things like water, soil, food. So other things that you can move around and transfer pathogens. I think I'll just stop at that one. So we have placenta, direct contact, indirect contact, and then the fourth major mode of transmission are vectors. And when we say vectors, we mean insects. And insects can transfer pathogens to people in two different ways. One is mechanically. You have some food sitting out, you're going to eat outside, and you have some food sitting out, and there's flies that landed on the fecal material from the dog poop in the yard, and then came over and landed on your salad, and then flew away. They mechanically transferred pathogens to your food. So we would call that a mechanical vector. A biological vector would be when an insect bites you. So it transfers Lyme disease, or an insect can transfer Lyme disease, or yellow fever, or all sorts of other things, malaria, different things to people. So vector transmission is another common way that we get exposed to pathogens. It's another common mode of transmission. So the four modes of transmission I want you to remember are placenta, direct, indirect, and vector. I think that's all I have. You're done.